I'm going to ask the panelists, is Dr. Dazarathy here? Like to sit in the front. And before we actually get started, I'm going to preemptively take the first question, and I'm going to address it to Dr. Pioro. But before I do that, I would like to take a poll of the audience. I would like you to raise your hand if you are on any of the following drugs: Prevacid, omeprazole, Prilosec, Nexium, Protonix, any proton pump inhibitor, all those who are on that medication. Dr. Pioro, could you give us a little rundown about the negative effects, if any, of proton pump inhibitors on bone metabolism, bone health?
So it's a very appropriate question that I get asked a lot about proton pump inhibitors for bone health. The data are mixed. It appears that proton pump inhibitors in some larger studies looking at very large patient cohorts and kind of looking at the statistics suggest that there is a decreased bone density that can occur over time with use of proton pump inhibitors. But you have to understand that these studies basically look at large numbers of patients and kind of analyze different criteria and come up with the statistics and say this is statistically associated or not. In studies that are smaller, that have specifically looked at patients using proton pump inhibitors, not large 10,000 type patient studies, there have not been any clear data indicating that proton pump inhibitors are problematic. Essentially, if you have, my understanding is that there is still enough acid left even after proton pump inhibitors to somewhat break down calcium into the bone to be absorbed from the stomach. And so unless you're using large doses, if you are using large double dose proton pump inhibitors, then that does become a concern. If it's simply like one pill a day, that should not be enough to prevent you from absorbing calcium. As I said, one way to get around that is to go with the calcium that does not require a breakdown by acid, which is calcium citrate. So in general, it's always, as always, it's a risk-benefit balance ratio. If your dyspepsia is so severe that the proton pump inhibitor truly makes a difference in your life, then you should continue to take it and just be aware of the need to supplement calcium either through diet, which is the preferred method, or through a calcium citrate type of calcium supplement.
Dr. Dazarathy, several questions about muscle. Muscle mass loss is a real problem the more advanced the liver disease gets, and even continues after transplant. Are there steps that you would recommend for someone with PSC before they even have cirrhosis to maintain or enhance muscle mass?
You know, this is a tough question, because if somebody is not taking adequate caloric intake and protein intake, which is about 50 kilocalories per kilo per day, and about 1.5 grams per kilo of moderately high quality protein, they should try to take it. Continued physical activity and maintaining vitamin D concentrations are probably beneficial, but how much exercise, what type of exercise, we really don't know the answer. All I can say is walking and keeping mobile are probably the only recommendations that can be made at this time, and it should be to whatever the tolerance for this physical activity is. The best intervention which really works is a late evening snack, which is making sure that you take either Boost, Ensure, Muscle Milk, even about 250 ml, that is about a glass of skim milk at night, and also making sure that you take a similar protein snack in the morning at breakfast. It's really critical to have a late evening snack and a morning breakfast to decrease this period of fasting that happens at night We call this as the window of anabolic opportunity because this is where we have the most potential to prevent muscle loss and to improve whatever muscle mass remains. Now, with regard to many of the other interventions that we are studying, unfortunately, most of them are at either preclinical, which is at the level of the cells and animals, or in human studies that we are doing, they are part of clinical trials which are funded by the National Institutes of Health. So in PSC, or in fact in any form of a disease, it is critical to try to institute these interventions even before there has been progression to cirrhosis, because it prevents the loss that accelerates after cirrhosis develops.
Could you just extend that a bit to talk about the value, if any, of continuing late-night snacks for someone who's had a transplant, still facing muscle mass loss?
This becomes even more complicated. The answer to this is I actually don't know, because I have not done any studies on looking at post-transplant metabolic alterations. It's fascinating. Unfortunately, I have not looked at it. It is not for lack of thinking about it. It is because I told Ricky, this is not a fair comment, but I'm going to do it anyway. Please do call your congressmen and senators and tell them to fund the National Institutes of Health. I cannot, and none of the other investigators can work without funding. It does not matter how much brain we have. If you do not have the resources, we cannot do these studies. So the only way we can get these answers is if there is a commitment made to developing an understanding of what is important to patients, which is fatigue, muscle loss, impaired quality of life. So these require funding, so hopefully somebody will do them. May not come from our country, may come from somebody else, because that seems to be the current thinking in Washington. We should hand over the research capabilities to other nations. I hope it does not happen. This is why I'm asking, please call. It cannot harm, so at least call. I think that answers it, even though it was a pitch towards asking for help.
Dr. Lashner, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. What would be the frequency of home treatment fecal transplantation? That is the number of enemas per week and the duration for ulcerative colitis would you not recommend?
There's no answer to that because you're not going to be doing it. So that's the end of that.
Okay. And a somewhat more serious vein, how about gut microbiota? How about probiotics? Do they have any role to play? If so, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so fecal transplant is indeed the perfect probiotic. It's got the right combination of bacteria, the right ones at the right combination. You'll never be able to replace that or figure that one out with probiotics. Remember, as probiotics are eaten, the acid in the stomach kill a lot of the bacteria. As it passes through the small bowel, they get digested and broken down, and very few probiotics actually make it to the colon where you need to have it. So I don't really recommend probiotics to anybody. I don't think they help or hurt, but I don't think they help you at all.
So a couple of related questions. Here's someone who is concerned about receiving multiple courses of antibiotics for cholangitis and the effect that might have on microbiota. Any information there?
So that's actually a very important question. I tell the people who get this fecal transplantation that they must never take antibiotics again unless they need it to save their lives. So a little infection like a cold or a cough, you really shouldn't be taking it. Even a urinary infection, you can get away with non-antibiotic treatment. If actually you have frequent cholangitis and you need antibiotics on a frequent basis, you shouldn't even get a fecal transplantation because it's all going to be wasted. What we're doing here is not eliminating C. diff, we're just crowding it out with good bacteria. So if you So we suppress it. So if you take antibiotics and get rid of the good bacteria, we've done nothing to help you. So you really should not be taking it if you frequently need antibiotics for other conditions.
So, Dr. Pioro, a couple of questions that relate to your presentation. First is Tums. Is Tums a good calcium supplement? And let me read the other one because they're kind of related. Please comment on calcium supplements from calcium phosphate from seaweed. Should magnesium be included with calcium supplementation?
So Tums is a perfectly good calcium supplement. It's calcium carbonate, though, so you do need to keep in mind the cautions that I mentioned earlier. If there are no contraindications, absolutely, I would go with the 500 or 600 milligram. In terms of other forms of calcium, there are calcium phosphate, calcium gluconate. They're all fairly similar. The only one that's been shown to be gentler on the stomach and easier to absorb with an irritated or inflamed bowel is calcium citrate. So there's no advantage that I'm aware of calcium phosphate or calcium gluconate. There are certain forms of calcium that are available as that can be dissolved in water, and so some of those are in the form of calcium phosphate or calcium gluconate for people who can't swallow pills. That does not necessarily mean they're easier to absorb at the level of the stomach, but the studies simply haven't been done. In terms of magnesium, I'm not aware of any calcium supplement that contains magnesium other than multivitamins, of course, and certainly those coexist. There's really no inhibition there as far as I'm concerned, if I understood the question properly.
Okay, good. So many physicians recommend that patients who have liver disease not drink alcohol at all, but here's a questioner who says how much alcohol actually does contribute to bone loss. Is there a threshold below which it might be safe from the bone perspective?
Yes, there is a threshold, and it corresponds to roughly 3 drinks per day. Depending on which, I would have to go and find the exact criteria, but that threshold of 3 drinks per day is the equivalent of 3 beers per day, and the equivalent in wine or hard liquor. Hard liquor would be less, of course. I can find that and bring that to Dr. Carey, and he can send that out.
Dr. Dazarathi, you mentioned protein snacks as being good to do. There's been a little bit of a change in the advice about protein and restricting protein in patients, particularly with advanced liver disease, perhaps with encephalopathy. Here's a questioner who wants to know, what about protein? In particular, are there protein powders that you would recommend? Branched chain amino acids. Is there anything specifically you would recommend for those who...
This is a very interesting question to me because we have looked at this for many decades. Now, which proteins, why was this dilemma of proteins even initiated? So, about 45 or 50 years ago, patients with liver disease, when they took a high protein or even protein in their meals, they were getting more confused. So, there started a thinking that proteins somehow contain nitrogen. Nitrogen is converted into ammonia when the proteins are broken down and results in confusion. So this became almost like folklore, that you cannot give proteins because there is this impression that if they take proteins, they become confused. About 18 or 19 years ago, the first randomized study was done in patients who, with cirrhosis, with similar severity, who were given proteins in appropriate quantities, that is about 1.5 grams per kilo per day, which is about 75 to 80 grams of protein per day, versus those who had a restricted protein, which is don't add any more protein, try to avoid any protein-containing meals. There was no difference in the occurrence of confusion. What was, however, observed, that patients who were on a low-protein diet infections, and they felt more fatigue, and therefore it was felt that not only was it safe, it was actually beneficial. So this is followed by a series of studies to understand how do you reconcile the previous observation. It's very easy to say that what was observed in the past was all wrong. It is not. So there have been very interesting studies that have looked at what is called as the encephalopathic potential of different proteins. All proteins are not the same. Animal proteins have the highest risk of creating confusion. Plant proteins, which are soy proteins, lentil-based proteins, they have the least risk of creating confusion, and dairy proteins, milk, yogurt, and I include egg whites in it, have an intermediate risk of creating confusion. So why not just prescribe only plant proteins? Because plant proteins do not have the same quality that animal proteins have. But there are ways to overcome it. Most of the lentils are deficient in one essential or critical amino acid, whereas cereal is deficient in another type of essential amino acid. So if you mix the two, bread with beans, rice with beans, or lentils, or tofu, this is nearly first-class protein with very low risk of confusion. However, the tolerance of plant proteins is another issue because there's a lot of fiber in plant proteins. So what we have recommended is a third of the protein from animal sources, a third from plant-based sources, and a third from dairy-based sources. There is no rationale to restrict proteins. However, there may be some consideration to be given to not making the entire protein intake based on animal-based proteins. I hope that answers it is a long answer to a short question.
Good answer. Here's a question for the entire panel. The narrow question is there a clinical trial for fecal transplant for PSC? But I'd really like to open the question up to say, how do patients find out about the availability of clinical trials that are looking for patients? So, Brett, why don't you start?
Yeah, so there's no clinical trial for PSC and fecal transplantation. There are clinical trials out there for fecal transplantation and inflammatory bowel disease. So keep your eye on that literature. How do you find out about it? There is a website called clinicaltrials.gov.
Clinicaltrials.gov, got it?
That does list
right,
the current clinical trial.
Yeah.
What? It's on your website already, yeah, okay. So, if you're interested in participating on a trial, you can, Cleveland Clinic is involved with many of these trials. You might want to call someone here at the Cleveland Clinic and see if we're participating.
All right, here, any other comments about where you find the availability of clinical
There
trials?
is. You should all look at what is called NIH Reporter. All the funding that is provided to the National Institutes of Health are public funds. So they are public database called NIH Reporter. The reporter is actually, it's a long form for a very long sentence. But if you go to NIH, if you Google NIH Reporter and you go in there, you can put in primary sclerosing cholangitis, every study that the government funds, the US government funds on PSC will show up there. You can see which ones are clinical studies, which ones are basic studies. And that's a very useful resource that can be used by everyone, should be used by everyone. And if you find that something is deficient, once again, call your congressmen and senators. I want you to leave with this idea, do not underestimate the value of these calls that are made.
Okay, we're going to just do one more question. This will be a quick one. Dr. Lashner, can you get C. diff if you've had your colon removed?
The answer is yes, but it's really rare. If the ileal pouch, we've seen C. diff, the ileal pouch, even C. diff in an ileostomy patient, but it is so rare that it's not worth worrying about.
Okay. Now that was too short an answer. One more brief one. Why does muscle wasting continue after transplant?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and we have investigated this in some depth. So what happens before transplantation is patients have liver disease. So the liver is unable to remove many of these toxins. Into the diseased liver releases a number of regulatory molecules that go to the muscle, and cause muscle loss. Now, the new liver has been provided. Unfortunately, after the new liver is provided, to maintain the graft, they are given two classes of medications. They are called mTOR inhibitors, which includes compounds like sirolimus, or calcineurin inhibitors, which includes compounds like cyclosporin, Prograf. Both of these directly affect muscle protein synthesis and breakdown negatively. So you're switching one problem with another problem. You need these medications to maintain the graft, but unfortunately, they come at a cost, and that is continued abnormalities in muscle protein balance.
Well, we're clearly not out of questions, okay? We could go on all afternoon. I want to thank, first of all, the audience for being so attentive and for asking such good questions, and I want to thank the speakers and panelists for your participation. Thank you all very much.